And now, without any further ado, I want to welcome our speaker for today, Hinda Young. Over the last almost 5 years that Rabbi Elton and Hinda have been at the Great, she has found her way into all of our hearts. Oh, why am I getting so verklempt? Her warm smile lights up the women's gallery every Shabbat morning when she makes a point of coming to each and every one of us to say Shabbat Shalom. Now, of course, joined by the beautiful Lizzie Elton. Hinda, before we get to your presentation, we'd all love to learn some more about the Hinda before Sydney. Where were you born and where did you grow up? Tell us about your childhood and your family.
So I was born actually in Valhalla, New York, but I was 10 weeks premature. So I was ambulanced to Westchester Medical Center. But I was actually, my parents were living in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is probably an hour and a half from New York City. And my dad was teaching at a university in Poughkeepsie, New York. So I spent my childhood there and in Albany, New York, which is also in upstate New York. And then when I was 13, my parents moved to West Hartford, Connecticut. So that's about 2.5 hours from New York City. So the Jewish world, as we'll come to learn, I think revolves around New York City a little bit. There is a diaspora, but my childhood was spent in smaller Jewish communities, smaller towns. And that's the gist.
And siblings?
So I have two younger siblings, Nathan and Miriam. They might be on this call as well. I think my whole family is listening in.
And we have met both of them at the Great Synagogue on their visits.
It's true. They've both visited. And it was a very, I attended Jewish day schools in Albany and in West Hartford, and through high school, through year 12, as we say here, and had a very, I think, typical American childhood. Played soccer and I don't even know. I think there is soccer here. And not that I was a big athlete, but I did play high school soccer, and it was very fun. Had a lot of really.
Right. So after high school, you went to study at McGill University in Montreal. Even though Canada is just across the border from the USA, was it hard to leave your family and move to another country at such a young age?
So no, it was very fun, very independent. And I actually thought that when I moved to Montreal, and then I spent a semester abroad in Rome, and I lived in Israel actually when I was 18. So right out of high school, I spent a year in Israel. And I think that moving to Australia was like the same thing. It was just a little fun adventure. And I have to say, we love it here, but it was a hard adjustment. I think the first year was not what I was expecting in terms of, it's not quite the same as being 6 hours away from your family, being 24 hours if you get a good connection, makes life more difficult, as I'm sure a lot of the people on this call who have families overseas can relate.
Absolutely. I think a lot of us know where you're coming from. I've also done 2 intercontinental moves, as have many others, and it's not easy, and it's incredible to see how you and the rabbi have settled down and made this your home. We're just so happy to have you. So now, you've been involved since you did move here in education, as you had been involved in teaching in New York before you moved here. What type of education are you involved in?
So in Sydney, I'm currently the director of the Sydney Melton program, which is adult Jewish education. So I think I'm seeing some familiar Melton students on this call. So we have a really extensive range of courses that are all developed at the Hebrew University. And what I was drawn to about Melton is when I was in university, I studied classics. So I studied ancient Greek and Latin and ancient history, and I loved it. I found it really just exciting and stimulating, and I especially loved Greek tragedy, reading the plays and in the original and then translating, but also just the stories of and so I found that really moving. But I did a minor in Jewish studies, and for me it really opened. I had this very not exactly classical Jewish education, but in my Jewish high school we studied the Chumash, the Bible, and we'd read the verse in Hebrew and translate it and look at the different commentaries in the original and translate that. I mean, a lot of my high school was spent, like, what is a very famous commentator is Rashi. So what does Rashi say about this verse? And, you have to give the explanation. So that was my Jewish education, and you learn the Jewish laws. But I didn't really, maybe I had a few classes on Jewish history, but it wasn't from an academic perspective, which is what I found in university, that looking, especially like social history, looking at, I don't know, not even like, I don't really remember like documentary evidence, but understanding that there was a whole field of Jewish studies that was more academic, followed the protocol that any other discipline would follow. So looking at sources and primary documents, and that was possible to do in Jewish history. And some of the the courses I took just really opened my eyes that there was a way to understand the traditions that I knew pretty, even just a Passover practice, a ritual that we do at our Seder, to understand sort of how that practice developed. And so that's what I've been doing with my work and what I love about the Melton program is it takes that same formula of really it's a sophisticated approach. It understands that adults, I think sometimes with Jewish education, and I even saw this in my high school, was that it's very much like learning like what to do. And I think you sometimes see that in certain styles of Jewish education, like a Hebrew school, a supplementary school, you might it's sort of on a base level, a level for children, telling people what to do. And what I found that's different about Melton is it's not just what to do, it's the why, it's the how, but it's also an understanding of the overall context. So that's what really inspired me in university, and that's what continues to inspire what I do. And some of the work that I've done with Jewish education with children, particularly for a year when I was living in Chicago after university, was sort of applying the same methodology to working with children. So understanding that, you have to meet children where they are, but making it a more complicated process of finding meaning through highly rigorous study. So learning Hebrew, learning the words that you need to know, but then using that to find meaning.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience, you taught, as you know, my granddaughter for her bat mitzvah, and your methods were so different to any kind of Jewish education that I had as a child. And you really grabbed her imagination, and she absolutely loved her classes with you. She really, really did. So thank you for that. So now, Hinda, we'd like you to share your presentation today, A Search for Ladino Culture in America. We're not going to interrupt you now. The floor is all yours, and then we'll have questions afterwards.
Okay, so how should I start? So growing up, as I said, I had a very typical American Jewish childhood. I went to Jewish day schools, but my mother's maiden name, and actually her current name, her last name, is Alkabes. So Alkabetz, Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, was a very famous Kabbalist in the 16th century, and he lived at the end of his life in Sfat. And he wrote what most people will know him for is the prayer Lecha Dodi, which we sing on Friday night. And so as a kid in Jewish day school, I got to say my ancestor was Shlomo Alkabetz. But that was most of what I knew about the fact that like my mother's family was Sephardi or had these roots. And I didn't know much more about her traditions because, and now I see my mom's siblings and maybe my mom are on, their childhood was also a very typical American Jewish childhood, and they didn't live in New York City. They grew up in Buffalo, New York, and they attended a Reform synagogue and Reform Hebrew school and a very Jewish childhood, Jewish camp, but nothing about it was particularly connected to their Sephardic heritage, except I remember my mom telling us that when she was a child, she would go to her grandparents for Passover Seder, and there were some Sephardic traditions that she remembered from her Seder. So she remembered passages that her grandfather would read in Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, and she remembered certain foods that her grandparents would make. And as a child, the only one she really recreated was a spinach and cheese frittata. So I knew if we had spinach frittata, which we usually had, I guess, Shabbat afternoons, that was something because my mother was Sephardic. And this, as I remember it, is that my father went to Seattle, where there's a large Jewish Sephardi community, a lot of Jews from Rhodes, and he brought back a Ladino Haggadah. And my brother is very good with languages. I'm not sure if he's on the call, but he has a real facility for languages, and we were all very interested in this Ladino Haggadah, and we wanted to sort of learn some of the songs or prayers that my mom remembered her grandfather saying in Ladino. So we added to our family Seder the halach ma'anya, when you hold up the matzah and say, this is the bread of affliction. My mother started saying, este es el pan de la afliccione, and saying it in Ladino, that the way her grandfather had. And that was basically the depth of my knowledge about my family's Sephardi roots. And the past few, I would say not even the past year, I would say the past few months, I've been wondering, like, my grandfather passed away in 2011, and I sort of felt like, why didn't I ask him more questions about his childhood? Because I knew that he grew up in the Lower East Side, and his mother passed away in 1993, my great grandmother Rebecca, and I knew that she spoke Ladino, but I didn't know much else about her life. So I started asking my mom more questions, and my mother's great uncle, Uncle Joe, passed away, I think, a few years ago. That's Carla's father-in-law. And my mother had asked Joe some questions. I think Joe was the person who knew the most about our family, but he unfortunately passed away as well. So I kept asking my mom in the last few months, like, what's the story? We don't know anything about Ladino. So my mom had my father bring me a book called L'America, the Sephardic Experience in the United States. And I started reading this book only a few months ago and sort of skimming it. And everything I read in the book, to be honest, just reaffirmed that my family is actually a very typical Sephardic story, because the book talks about how the Ladino speaking, the waves of Turkish immigration that were, between, I think, like 1880 to like 1920 was the big waves of Sephardic immigration. So what happens is that the German, well, not exactly German, but the Ashkenazi Jews the German Ashkenazi Jews come really early and to America, and they establish themselves as, sort of a Jewish community, and they gain wealth and prominence. And also at a certain time, there were sort of the Spanish Portuguese community. So which are Sephardi, but they sort of came through Holland. And the big synagogue in New York is called Shereth Israel. And that's older. That's one of the oldest synagogues and oldest Jewish communities. And they'd also established themselves. And I mean, their synagogue is in the Upper West Side on the 70s. So then what happened, and then there's waves of Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants from Poland, from Russia, living on the Lower East Side. If you've ever visited New York and you've been to the Lower East Side, there's the tenement museums. There's a whole Yiddish speaking story of the Lower East Side with the pickle vendors. And what you don't hear so much about when you're taking a tour of the Lower East Side is the Ladino speaking community and the Sephardic experience. And I think that to a certain extent is because there were more Ashkenazi Jews. And I think the Sephardic experience is like a little bit later, after the Ashkenazi Jews have already sort of settled in, and what happens is it's a smaller community, and it slowly does start to disperse. A lot of Sephardi Jews move uptown to Harlem, and there's not big, but the big Sephardi Jewish communities in the US moved to Seattle, which is on the West Coast. Seattle, Washington, and LA, Los Angeles. So it's not such a large community, and it's a bit later. And my great-grandparents, Chaim and Rebecca, who are the main characters in this story, they come from Turkey in the 1920s. And 1920 is when Rebecca comes, and 1923, I believe, is when Chaim comes. And so it's after the main wave of Sephardic immigration, but they're Turkish immigrants. They speak Ladino. They don't speak Yiddish, which is the language of the push carts and the stores. And they get married, they have a family, and the big question for me is, why didn't my mother grow up with this wealth of Sephardi traditions? And looking into the Sephardic story, what I see is that her story is just very typical. A lot of the Sephardi traditions got lost because the Sephardi community was never united. There were always lots of factions. So people were from Turkey, they were from Edirne, which is Adrianople, which is actually where my grandfather's from. So the Jews from Edirne spent time with other Jews from Edirne. And the Jews from Salonika wanted to be together with all the other Jews from Salonika. And the Jews from Rhodes were with the other Jews from Rhodes, and they didn't unite as one big Sephardic community because they were from all these different places with all these different unique customs. And when I started asking my mother and my great aunt questions about what my grandfather and and his siblings' experiences is that they actually attended Ashkenazi Hebrew school. And part of that is because my great-grandfather thought it was better, like a better school. And when I read La America, this book, that's actually, there were so many fights about, we need to start a Talmud Torah. And one group would start a Talmud Torah for their people, and another group would start a Talmud Torah for this people, and they'd give money to start this cultural club, but then somebody else would say, but we know we need the Talmud Torah, the education's most important. So I can imagine that my great-grandfather got a bit fed up and said, right, we're just gonna go to the best Hebrew school, or the Talmud Torah that's Ashkenazi, that they're not fighting. And so you can imagine that the people of my grandfather's generation, him and his siblings, didn't really, when they were learning about the Jewish traditions in their school, it wasn't the Sephardi traditions. That's one element. But the big question that then plagued me was really about my great-grandmother, Grandma Rebecca. And my mother had told me a while ago that my great-grandmother was illiterate. And I was talking to Ben, Rabbi Elton, about this, and Rabbi Elton said, but wouldn't she have known the prayers? Because that's didn't she have a sitter? And I actually, my great aunt who's still alive, who doesn't have, she doesn't really, it's not that her mind is going, but I think actually it wasn't the most, my great grandfather didn't have such a strong, he had strong opinions about women, and I don't think he ever encouraged my great grandmother to learn to read and write, and he didn't encourage his daughter to get an education. And he strongly encouraged his sons to get educations, to get college educations, but he didn't support his daughter going to college. And I think that my great aunt actually, in some ways, has maybe tried not to remember some of these details about her childhood or her Jewish experience, because it might be wrapped up a bit in like feelings of sort of being excluded from the Jewish experience, or like not, I think she did go to Talmud Torah, but maybe not learning Hebrew. So my great grandmother didn't know how to read or write in English or Ladino, but she spoke Ladino, and she spoke Greek, and she spoke French, and she spoke English, and she knew, my great aunt told me that she knew how to say the blessings over the candles, and she learned a lot of the traditional cooking from her mother. And so she had a strong Jewish identity, but it wasn't written, it was oral. And again, using that little bit of information about my family helped me understand sort of what the historians put in the books, because the historians are talking about L'America was the title of a Ladino newspaper, and then there was La Vara, which L'America ran until about 1923, and La Vara was ran until 1934, and these were newspapers printed in Ladino. But if a lot of the women weren't encouraged to read or write Ladino, I think that might be how some of the tradition sort of lost hold, because there isn't a preserved written record, and it's all oral. And I think it's harder in some ways. I mean, from what I studied with Greek and Latin, so much is preserved, through bards and the repetition. And I think my father was telling me that, the Sephardi synagogue has a certain cadence to the prayers, and maybe that was a way to pass on the prayers orally. But I think that does pose a problem when there's a language of Ladino in a new country where the dominant language is English. Even if the children are being, my great-grandparents spoke Ladino to their children, but they wanted their children to speak, they didn't call it Ladino, they called it Spanish. They wanted their children to speak Spanish. But obviously my grandfather and his siblings were living in an English-speaking world, and it's much harder to continue these traditions when everything else is happening in English. And so La Vara actually started to publish their newspaper in English to appeal to a younger Sephardi reader and try and promote Sephardi culture. But what sort of ends up happening is the Sephardi community sort of, there's a diaspora. It moves to, as I said, to Seattle, to LA, all around the US. And I think, again, to a certain extent, that's my family story. My grandfather actually married my grandmother, who was from an Ashkenazi background, German Jewish. They met on Fire Island, which was not the Fire Island of today, for anyone who's listening and very familiar with Fire Island. It's an island outside of New York, and they were sort of on summer vacation, and they met, and I guess they were both there with groups of friends, but they were not from similar backgrounds, Sephardi heritage. Although my great uncle, he married a woman from Rhodes, from Greece. And so their family life was much more steeped in Sephardi tradition. They had a Sephardi cultural club. They stayed in New York. And my great aunt, Aunt Ray, married a boy from the neighborhood as they called it, the Lower East Side, and he was also from Sephardi background. And they also, I think, maintained more of a Sephardi friend group and a social group. But my grandfather married my grandmother, who was from an Ashkenazi background, and they left New York City. And I think, they lived in Iowa and then in Buffalo, New York. And I don't think there were many other Jews from Turkey, Ladino speakers. And that's how I think a lot of the traditions got lost. But I don't actually think that that is a unique experience. In sort of preparing for this talk, I've done a bit of Googling. I found there's a whole website devoted, it's called Sephardic Brotherhood, and they have these talks they've been offering during this time of COVID. They've been offering Zoom classes, and one of the Zoom classes that I found that I listened to a little bit of was a woman talking about passing on Sephardic traditions. And honestly, when she gave her story, it was so similar to mine in that she grew up, she sort of remembered eating these pastries at her grandparents' house, but none of these traditions really stuck. And then she and her mom found the Ladino songs to sing at the Seder. And I think a lot of Jews of my generation from Sephardic descent are doing the same process of researching the traditions of their grandparents, great-grandparents, and trying to maybe bring them back into their family story. So, and I think the Sephardic Brotherhood, again, this is just like a little tidbit that illustrates how common this is. Sephardic Brotherhood was started by Jews from Salonika, and then it became a greater organization for Sephardic Jews, a cultural organization, but also the main thing it did was a burial society. And those of us who have connections to England will be very familiar with burial societies, in that you pay into the burial board throughout your life, and then when you pass away, you are buried. And it's similar to, like, the Chaver Kadisha here has a very different model where, the Chaver Kadisha takes care of the burial arrangements and then bills the family. But in the Sephardic community and in England, it happens throughout your life. So why is this relevant? Because I found my great-grandparents' records of their burial, and it lists which organization buried them in the cemetery, and they were buried by Sephardic Brotherhood. But I thought, that's odd. That doesn't really reflect the narrative. Why would they be buried by like Jews from Salonika? And then I thought, well, they're part of a wider, it became the like umbrella organization. But actually, speaking to my mom's been wonderful. She's on this call, but I'll just say she called her cousin, who had a bit more information, and her cousin told her that actually my great-grandparents were part of a burial board of people just from Salonika, and I think, not Salonika, Edernay, which was where they were from, a very specific burial board, like a smaller community, and eventually it merged with this Sephardic Brotherhood. So there's been a lot of information coming at you, but what I found in all this research was that this story is so not unique, and that it's really hard. Like, some of the questions I had going in were like, well, did my great-grandmother like speak Ladino in the shops? Because like from what I knew about the Lower East Side, it was very Yiddish speaking. So who did she communicate with? And I think it was true that there were other Sephardi Jews in the Lower East Side speaking Ladino, and she had her circle of friends. But I think for my great-grandparents coming from Turkey to the US, the goal really was that their children would adapt to the US, speak English. And part of that, I think the natural, maybe not inevitable, but the natural consequence was that so many of these like very specific Sephardi traditions got lost. And I think it also had to do with the nature of the Sephardic community, the fact that it wasn't one big unified community. It was very localized. And another detail that my mom's cousin told her was that my great-grandfather actually didn't necessarily pray in a synagogue with a rabbi, that different people in the community would have like a shop, and during the week, and on Shabbat they would gather in that shop without an official rabbi, but that would be their little like community synagogue. So that lends itself to sort of a fracturing of the community, and it doesn't necessarily lend itself to like passing down like one monolithic identity. Not to say that Ashkenazi Judaism is like a monolithic identity, but I think we have an overarching traditions that have been passed down in the Ashkenazi community. So I think now is a good time to open it up for questions. And if my relatives, I mean, this is so, want to contradict anything I've said, I'm like so intimidated, or add, I'm totally open, because this has been like a little project of mine and I still have a lot of questions. And the saddest part to me is that I don't really think there's anyone who can answer them.